Now we know how history is written, and you know where it comes from. I want to move on to what you will be doing as students, and that is, how are you going to analyze these historical sources? How are you going to analyze things like this historical letter that I almost threw away? Or other documents like newspaper articles or whatnot. And you're thinking, I can fall asleep during this part because I'm never going to do this. But in reality, that is what your paper assignments are, is primary source analysis. So stay awake. And not only that, put a star by this part of your, in your notebooks or in your notes, so that when you do go to do your first primary source analysis, you can go back and refresh your memory on how to exactly to do that. All right? So here we go. First of all, let's identify that there are two types of historical sources. There are primary sources, and these are sources that are written during the time. This is a first-hand eyewitness account of the event. First-hand account of the event. Examples could be even published versions, like this is Joseph Plum Martin's diary of a Revolutionary War soldier. Even though this was published many years later, since it has his exact words, or even if it's a document that's written in another language, even a translated version is still considered to be a primary source. Speeches. This book has lists of speeches. In fact, they say 100 speeches that changed the world. Since it has the entirety of the speech in it, it's still considered a primary source, even though this book was published in 2005. Okay? So a lot of students get confused because they don't have the actual historical document in their hand, that it doesn't count as a historical source. That's not true. Government and court documents that we talked about earlier, this would be considered a government document. The government issued ration stamps, and so that would be considered a primary source. Newspapers and magazines. Now, not all magazines are considered a primary source. Let me give you an example. It's really wearing out because I carry it with me too much. This is a 2003 magazine about Benjamin Franklin. Is that a primary source about Benjamin Franklin? No. So this is, since it was published in 2003 about Benjamin Franklin, it is not a primary source. Most people understand that unpublished documents, the kind that I was showing you, letters and journals, are primary sources. These are a little bit harder to find. Most libraries have what they call special collections. They're usually kept in boxes in a back room that you have to request, and they bring it out to you in a special room, and they maybe even give you gloves depending on how old the documents are, and let you look through the box, maybe make copies, again, depending on how old the documents are. And so this type of research using the documents that aren't published is a lot more difficult, except that libraries are beginning to digitize these wonderful collections so that no matter where you are in the world, you have access to these. There's still just a minute portion of these that are available online, but it's a great service to you. When I was doing my master's thesis, I had to fly to the different libraries that had whatever document I wanted to see, which gave me an excuse to travel, so that's not so bad. Okay, so secondary sources are sources that are made up of somebody reading primary sources and writing a book about it. It's as simple as that. An example, we'll stick to the Benjamin Franklin theme. Sheila Skimp wrote a book about Benjamin Franklin. Do you suppose she used his autobiography as one of her sources? Certainly. And so this is just a secondary source. Also, magazine articles like the one we showed you earlier. This is a secondary source. It's published in a magazine. There are also academic journals. For the sake of academic research, I would always recommend academic journals, which are peer-reviewed, journals written by someone in that profession for people in that profession, rather than a magazine which is written by someone in the profession for the general public. So this is not going to have the footnotes, maybe this one's not going to have all the graphs and as much data. The academic journal is the one that you're going to need if you're a student. And so our library has wonderful databases for you to use to get academic journals. It's a great source of items. Books, academic journals, magazines are all types of secondary sources. Well, there's a third level of source too, and this is where somebody analyzes a variety of secondary sources and puts it in a book. And what do we call that? I need new batteries, apparently. What do we call that? Textbook, right? Although textbooks are getting a little bit better, they're actually including primary sources right in them, but a textbook is an analysis of secondary sources. And oops, it's not there. But also, research papers is an analysis of secondary sources. So we have just a few more minutes. I want to talk about how do you know if a primary source is good? How do you know if a primary source is reliable, not lies? And again, this is what you'll be doing in your primary source analysis. And so let's just choose one here. Well, let's use the grandfather letter. It's a good example. So how do you know if this is a good source? Well, number one, you ask yourself who's the author. And ask yourself, is it, what position did he have in that circumstance, that event? We know that he was a civilian. We know that he was a machinist. And we know his name. That's really all we know about him. The next question you want to ask yourself is when, why? Put it in its context. When was it written? We know that. He has a date on it. Why did he write it? Probably because he was homesick. He talks about his wife's meatloaf. Putting it in its context, that is really important in history. In other words, what was going on surrounding the event that we're writing at? We know that he was in the middle of the Pacific. We know that Japan was becoming aggressive during the time period he was there and that they were trying to take over various islands. The context around the letter is what's important to understand what's in the letter, okay? Ask yourself what caused him to be there writing this letter. Oops. Okay. I jumped ahead of myself. I apologize. Ask yourself, could he be lying? Could this whole thing be fabricated? Is he making it up? Is he not telling the truth? Now, I can tell you in the primary sources I give you to analyze, it's not going to be complete fabrication, right? And then you're going to ask yourself, does he have an agenda? What is the agenda of this person? An example of that would be a political speech. If a politician is giving a political speech, what is their agenda? To convince you of something, to get votes, right? And so if you know their agenda, are you going to understand their bias? Absolutely. What was the purpose? What's the purpose of the person writing this document? If you understand their purpose, like in a journal, they're writing it so they don't forget, or a letter, they're writing it to keep in touch with a family member. What is the purpose of that particular document you're reading? Who is the audience? Who is the intended audience? Understanding the audience, again, tells us. So this is going to be different if it's a government official document to a general, right? If their audience is a general, it's going to be very different than a man writing to his wife in the same time period, right? Very different. Oops, I'm not going to go there yet. Sorry, I apologize. And so when you're looking at these documents, if you ask yourself these questions, you're going to become, in a very easy format, analyzing the same document. You're going to be able to analyze what was going on at the time that that particular document was being written, and therefore understand the event from that person's perspective.